It's 11, so we can start. First one, Sister Mary Elizabeth Imler, and authentic servant leadership in an authentic community in the Franciscan tradition. Make you co-host.
We're good.
There you go.
So thank you very much. It's wonderful to be part of this from a distance. And I apologize for the glare behind me, but we don't get a lot of sun, so I'm just going to keep it glaring there. That's not my halo, just to make note of that. I'm Vice President for Mission at the University of St. Francis. I've been here for more than 10 years in that role. I've been a Franciscan pilgrimage leader for almost 20 years with the Franciscan Pilgrimage Program, and 40 years as a religious sister, and a lot more than that as a family member of 6 siblings. I mention all of those things because I think it gives you a context out of which my lens is for looking at this particular topic. I wanted to do it really in 2 parts. First is the foundation of an authentic community and Franciscan community. So for me, that's really grounded in the Franciscan tradition and charism of both Francis and Clare, and the 800-year movement that follows that. I think it's really key that we have a balance of this virtual engagement with in-person dimension, and I think that'll come out as we do that. But as all things Franciscan, what I'd like to do definitely is to ground this in servant leadership, Greenleaf being the originator of that term way back in 1970, but the pattern, I think Francis and Clare both picked up, and certainly out of the Gospels. And that's where I'd like to begin. Sandra Schneider wrote an extensive exploration of the Johannine Gospel called Written That You May Believe. And she gave me kind of an idea of tracing how the language that Jesus uses in referencing the relationship that he has with those followers informing that community, and how that servant leadership model comes out of that. So that's what I'd like to do just in this first beginning part, because I think it's important how that relationship develops the community and the structure that's there. I think a lot of the adaptation that I've read from business models have taken that servant leadership and kind of diminished the values of humility and poverty that we get out of that in a more secular business approach. So I do think this Franciscan model has a lot to offer in relation to that. So just quickly through this, because I'm sure we haven't all read John's Gospel just recently, but in the very beginning in John 1, he calls each of the followers by name, Peter, John, etc. And later on, then he begins to reference them as disciples. Here, referencing them as someone who is being led, someone who will learn from the master, and then certainly have to meet certain expectations within that group. And most of the gospel, that's exactly the language that he uses. He rarely uses the word apostle, meaning to send out. And that really comes at the end of the gospel. So what we find here is that throughout the gospel of John, different than the synoptics, he uses this term disciple, until we come near the end of where Jesus realizes he's near the end of his life. And I think significantly here, he begins to refer to them as little children. And in that Eucharistic priestly prayer, he says very clearly then, I shall no longer call you servants, but I'm going to call you friends. Now, when Joan Chittister did a lot of work with this, she thought this was the climax or the culmination of that relationship. And she refers to a community as a gathering of friends, where they share around a table because he reveals everything to them. However, this really is not the end of the Johannine tradition that's there, nor is it the end of the story. It's not that Jesus has the Last Supper and then dies and that's the end. We know that as we just head into our holiest week now and towards our Easter celebration. The post-resurrection event is very, very significant, in which Mary Magdalene is told when she encounters this resurrected Christ. And again, it's the resurrected Christ. So we move now from Jesus to this Christological moment. And Jesus Christ says to her, "Go and tell my brothers," and I would add, "and sisters, I will meet them in Galilee." So the final reference that the Johannine text uses for Jesus is referring to them as brothers. And so the salvific event changes the relationship into this more familial place of mutuality in which he refers to them as brothers. And significantly, he tells Mary Magdalene, says, "I will meet them in Galilee," back to that place of ministry, back where we have our foundation. I think it's very keen that Francis picks up on this very much so in his own life and understands this relationship as brothers. He hears that in the San Damiano experience and forms what the language we're beginning to use more and more in our Franciscan parlance is about this relationship, fraternitas. Some people kind of balk at that because it's not fraternity. It's not a gathering of all male gender. We know that because Clare never uses the counter to that of sorority. It is fraternitas. And where does this come from? It's very clearly, I think, as Francis begins to understand and actually echoes Jesus in his post-resurrection language when he talks in his testament, "Afterwards, the Lord gave me some brothers, and no one showed me what to do." This brother relationship, because Jesus says to each one of us, "I am your brother. I am your brother. I'm your brother." And if he's brother to each of us, that makes us brothers and sisters to one another. And it's through the Christed event that we have this fraternitas, which is why it is the masculine dimension. Interestingly enough, though, in the Italian or the Latin parlance, it's a feminine noun. And I think there we have a sense that this gives us that sort of nurturing, compassionate kind of experience about how they relate to one another. So this relationship is what really, I think, is the authentic foundation of community. It is this salvific moment that gives us a sense for generations to be considered in fraternitas. And I think this underlies, particularly in higher ed, but in any workplace where that Franciscan dimension is there, is that we have this relationship grounded in that we are brothers and sisters to one another through our brother Jesus. The title that the Franciscans use in this sense for the leader then, who comes out of that, is to be the minister and servant. Both terms refer to the person who is the leader. So it's a dual role, but it's found again within this fraternitas because, as we know with some of the Franciscan orders, they still refer to the minister and servant as brother. Even if he might be a priest, they are brother to one another. And interestingly enough, they are called to lead and called to serve, not necessarily elected in that regard. So it's this sense of relationship, I think, that is very key of the community that pulls together, that defines how the leader comes out of that. I think as some of you are familiar with the AFCU characteristics for higher ed, these all have to be grounded in the Gospels. There's a sense of relationship and a keen sense of sacramentality. So what I'd like to do is to just take a look at a couple of these characteristics of how this plays out in regard to the leader itself, him or herself. So one of those is that it is a privilege to serve in leadership, but it's also a duty. And I think it's, again, in a more business parlance, I think people feel it's a privilege to be in that place, different perks, as they say, that comes out of that. But what I'd like to point out is an example here is that the servant leader, as Greenleaf says, is servant first. Now, again, it's a both and, so I'm not trying to separate it. It is both minister and servant, so you're called to lead and called to serve. But first is primary that sense of service, being called into that service. The example I'd like to use is oftentimes when I'm at the refectory at San Damiano, there's a place where Claire always sat. And so there's a bouquet of flowers there to mark that place, literally a place of privilege. And it was near the kitchen, which is sort of fascinating. But what's more important is that it was not in the center. It was at the end of the table, which means she could get up, and probably did get up, to help and to serve the others. And we see that in Francis's Rule for Hermitage, where he says that there are roles for the Marthas and the Marys. And there, again, that balance of the service privilege, duty, and minister privilege that's there. So one of the things I'd like to distinguish, that the authentic Franciscan leader has a dual role of privilege and duty. Secondly, very different than the monastic tradition, or even of the royalty of the kings and queens, the Franciscan tradition of leadership for the very first time in history had an experience of relinquishment, where Francis literally gives up that title and passes it on to someone else. Never had that happen. You were always the abbot or the abbess for life. You were always the king or queen for life. We see that with Queen Elizabeth in England today. But that relinquishment to say, I'm not going to hang on to this forever. Again, we can see this in the Rule for Hermitages, where they can exchange that. So the Marthas would take the place of the Marys, and they would exchange that role. So they weren't always in that role of entitlement. I think we can see here in that sense, maybe a CEO, perhaps they're working on a particular task, and he finds that this isn't his strength or her strength. And so the leader would pass on the leadership or that sense of minister to someone else that can contribute, perhaps because it is their strength. But the key here is, as they step aside from that, they must still continue to contribute. So it's not that the leader just says, okay, here's our next task. This isn't my bailiwick, so it's yours to do. But the leader becomes one with them in working together. And there's no shame or embarrassment, but it's out of humility, knowing the gifts of the other, and most importantly, knowing the leader's own limitation. It's out of that weakness that we gather together, that I need others. So it's that practice of relinquishing the lead, that you don't always have to have that place of privilege. I put this little reserve parking place up there because I remember doing this first with my own president. And I said, as a perk of a president, you don't necessarily get this privilege of having a special parking place. All of us have to hunt and peck for a parking place. And so he proudly has this parking sign in his office, not in a special place. So allowing that participation that's all of us can share in. Another part of our Franciscan tradition we can see in Francis, and less so in Clare, but differently, is that sense of itineracy. There was always, the Franciscans were on the move. They didn't have, like the monastic tradition, a convento, an established place. Francis traveled around, and he experienced great itineracy because the Son of God had nowhere to lay his head. The reverse of that itineracy was Clare, in that her convents were always built on busy roadways. In fact, the San Damiano one is the pathway that everybody would go from the north or the west to Rome. So the itinerary was that people passed by them, whereas Francis actually went out. Part of that was the gender pieces of medieval times, that women couldn't travel the way the men could. But itineracy is very, very key to our Franciscan tradition. So how does that play out? I think it does so well in terms of assessments or visiting one another. In fact, in the earlier rule, it says the minister and servant is to visit, admonish, and encourage. And again, this was very new to the Franciscan movement, different than the monastic tradition. They literally were to go out of their place, wherever they were, and visit the brothers and sisters. Whereas you might know in an abbot or an abbess, they would come to the office of the abbot or the abbess. And so I think this is very significant, that a servant leader is not sitting in their office receiving their associate and barking out orders or directions, but rather that the leader goes to that other place. Again, similar to the gospel, go to Galilee, go to the place where you are most comfortable, not in my office of power, but rather where you feel most comfortable, where I can see your domain and what you are about. And so that sense of receiving the other, and key here too, that you give honest feedback. It should be good affirmation, but also accountability. So admonish and encourage, very, very significant. Francis uses the language that it's where one can speak or act as an employer would with a worker. So here we have a sense of an upside down piece of that, is that the servant leader is literally the employed. They're the employed one. They're the ones that they're working for everybody else. And so Francis defines this quality of the servant leader as treating the other as master and not as subject. So this kind of upside down sense of humility, I think that we have that. We know Francis was very critical about the crickets, and I have a wonderful picture of the statue there at the Portiuncula. It's the preferential option for that little one. So I'm going to come to you. I want to respect you as best we can, because the Holy Spirit really is in charge of this. When we look at the power, it's very different to think in the Franciscan tradition. Again, it's typically hierarchical, but we find that in the Franciscan movement, it's much more horizontal, where mutuality is very important. And we see that so much in Clare's writing, where we come together in those formative experiences and help one another. Certainly, it's important. I think we have a sense of how Francis and Clare gazed through the Gospels, considered them, contemplating, because they wanted to imitate Jesus. They wanted to imitate the Christ that was there. And so we find a sense here of very literal imitation of this kind of leadership, with both Francis and Clare often washing the feet. So it's in the orthopraxy, it's the actual doing that the leader demonstrates that. How does that happen? I think in our Franciscan tradition is that one must stand under those that you serve to really understand the other, to be able to look not top down, but either horizontal or underneath that, as we know from there. So that legitimate needs must be sought out by the leader themselves. And certainly, I think key to this is creating a space where, in fact, the followers will flourish. Often quoted from Greenleaf is, the best leaders are clear. Are those served, do they grow as persons? Do they become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, and more likely themselves to become leaders? And this was a lot of what Francis and Clare both worked with, trying to create a space where human beings could flourish. Certainly they had a mission in common, they had behaviors that were there, but did they create a culture where in fact others could flourish, that they had a purpose that was in mind there? And that comes out of that fraternitas, that communion that the Franciscan community is formed out of. So we see very clearly here in Francis's admonition how important it is to not appropriate the role of being over others. And it's a wonderful quote, again, imitating the gospel passages that are there.
Sister, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. So I'm just on that point. So I think the signs of distinction here, as I look through that, are very clear about servant leadership. And I think Francis, our Pope, gives us some wonderful examples of how washing the feet is so significant. And as we know from Jesus's gospel there in John, and I'll close with that, do you know what I have done? And as Francis says, now you know what to have to. I've set you an example. It's in that doing. And so I invite us, that those of us who are called to lead and to serve, to step aside necessarily from the virtual world and back into that sacred space of fraternitas and do likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I always like when people have questions right away instead of waiting to the end. I know I'm probably the exception, but if there are any questions.
Especially for 3 of them, that makes a lot more sense. So
Yeah.
any questions or comments now? Well, I can start with one right here. I have many years, I guess we have to be looking here if you're over here. I've used the words, I'm not Catholic, but I've been at Bonaventure for 20 years. And one thing I've often thought that impressed me very early was the terms fraternitas and evangelization. So those are 2 terms that most Catholics would say really don't apply, but really it is part of the Catholic experience, because we can think fraternity as a college something, we think evangelization is something that other churches do. In your experience, is it sometimes difficult to sort of communicate these terms to people that have such adverse reaction to these concepts?
Yes, probably a lot with the women community. They hate the word fraternitas, but as we begin to understand that it is as Jesus is that brother relationship that helps, I think. And I think tracing these things, or even just paying attention to that post-resurrection event, helps us to understand that fraternitas, and I don't ever translate it out of that original Umbrian dialect that's there. So I don't talk about fraternity. I don't talk about the brotherhood and sisterhood because there's mystery to that language of fraternitas, similar to the language of communion. It's very different than community. I hope that helps. Good question.
Other questions over here?
I have a question. Thank you, sister, especially for the inclusion of the imagery of the washing of the feet, especially as we enter Holy Week. I thought that was really, really good. Your incisive commentary on the salvific moment, I just had a question there. Do you find that it's the sustaining feature or component of celebrating our fellowship?
Absolutely. I think, again, we know from our Franciscan tradition, Jesus didn't come to make us any better, but just to show us the way. And I think in that incarnational moment, that is what we celebrate. So, yeah, that's that significant thing of becoming back to the original, which is inclusive of that Trinitarian perichoresis of the dance. So, yes. You're right, the timeliness in our season of Lent into Easter is exciting. I also was very thoughtful that it's on Palm Sunday that Claire gives up and departs from the family and enters into that Benedictine experience. Imagine what the Gospels that she heard during that week that helped her to be convinced of following that call to lead and to serve. And it wasn't in a Benedictine space. Thank you.
So since I am the official timekeepers co-chair, I guess we're going to proceed with the next speaker.
Tim. Tim, you're up.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'll make you come.
I really appreciate it. My name is Tim Weldon. I've been at University of St. Francis in Joliet for 21 years now, 30 years teaching in higher education. Happy for every year. Let me just say again, good morning, and I want to extend heartfelt appreciation to St. Bonaventure University, the Foster Center for Responsible Leadership, Dr. Mike Gallagher, and the staff for their all-inclusive graciousness, organization, and foresight in hosting this conference. I also want to give belated mention that I think is due for the gallant performance of the St. Bonaventure basketball team and their appearance in the NIT last month. Some of their postseason games I found was the best must-watch sports viewing in the year so far. It is an honor to be before you today and presenting with my colleagues, Sister Mary Elizabeth, Arsmi, and Conrad. Please know that my thoughts this morning are for all, but even more for those immersed in education, the student, the administrator, staff, and faculty, each of whom have dedicated themselves to advancing the common good. To begin, I draw upon the exhortation of the British novelist E.M. Forster, who in his novel, Howard's End, reminds us that in life, we've to only connect. And I want to mention that again, only connect. It's one of the keys to not only the novel, but his writing. To this end, our presence at the conference confirms a laudable willingness, and our participation in the conference confirms connecting's inestimable value. Yet, our connecting and our connections are challenged, vulnerable to the reductive misunderstandings about technology, impoverished by the misunderstandings about communities, and an authentic philosophy of the person, founder and sustainer of every community. For the sake of context, let me say that so much of what concerns our conference theme, creating authentic communities in a digital age, plays out in the philosophy of one 20th century Catholic thinker. And he was just mentioned last night in the opening talk, so I really appreciate that. I'm speaking of Gabriel Marcel, who died in 1973, but a brief glance at a theme in his work reveals as much. In Marcel's essay, The Ontological Mystery, taken from his 1968 work, The Philosophy of Existentialism, Marcel responded to the loom of the technocratic era with the following, and I quote, "I've said that man is at the mercy of his techniques," unquote. Or if we were to put that in contemporary parlance, we are at the mercy now of our technology. Surely in a world where daily screen time may occupy a quarter of one's day, including look at our phones an estimated 63 times daily, where telework and digital relationships are a growing reality, our contemporary orientation to technology grows ever deeper and more complicated. In the dawn of the transition to the digital age, I'm somewhat drawn, and this is, I just say this as a side note, by analogy, of course, to the Gospel of Matthew and his admonishments against the overreach or the over influence of avarice, where he says in Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. Now, cognizant of the temptation to assume the positions of a neo-Luddite, and in full acknowledgement that here and nearly everywhere, today and tomorrow, we are better for technology. And I posit that the Catholic convert Marcel made sure that hope would always have the last word. Father Lesko was right to summarize Marcel's philosophy and one of the themes of our conference when he defined authentic relationships accordingly. And I quote, "The meaningfulness and the authenticity of one's existence as an I is totally conditioned by the generosity with which I make myself available in mutual love, fidelity, faith, and disponibility to the thou," unquote. Whereas thinkers such as Marcel, Pascal, Kierkegaard serve to guide and inspire. As participants in the Franciscan legacy, we've in fact a whole tradition from which to draw. Indeed, we are heartened by an 800-year-old animating heritage, love born and living through the leadership of Francis and Clare, both of whom, in and through community formation, are exemplars of authentic community. It is to the latter I turn, specifically with a brief discussion on the authentic itself. In general, authenticity, as conceptualized, as thematized by theocentric existentialists, and highlighted by the aforementioned, offered a vision of the human person in the context of a meaningful, dignity and virtue-laden life, experienced communally, within the co-presence of God and humanity. In this light, what the authentic requires, over and against the inauthentic, is a degree of self-understanding, including an active engagement with the reality of our shared dignity and the sanctity of life. More, and subsequently, it requires a commitment to the common good, including a commitment to the amelioration of human suffering. Thus, the authentic provides the existential context for self-understanding, the latter to be found in high relief in the Franciscan intellectual tradition, which is especially helpful, if not pivotal, to use the words of our conference overview, in the recovery or reclaiming of authentic community. Herein, I focused on the foundational thoughts of a pair of 13th century scholars and Franciscan friars. The first being the subtle doctor, John Duns Scotus, and then the outstanding Dr. Roger Bacon. Among his notable contributions to philosophy, notably his treatment of volition, epistemology and to theology, notably his reasoning on and defense of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, and to his contribution to the humanities in general, Scotus' contribution to philosophy of the human person influences still. For Scotus, the human person is to be understood as entirely and invaluably unique. He explains as much in his theory of haecceity, or thisness, haec meaning this in Latin, and this meaning that which differentiates this from that, or what distinguishes in uniqueness, as in this one. Herein we find, according to Scotus scholar Father Alan Walter, haecceity's twofold function, and I quote, "First, that it makes each individual unique and incapable of duplication, even by an omnipotent God. And second, that haecceity differentiates it radically and ultimately from each and every individual, unquote." Father Walter goes on to point out the implications of such a theory. And I read, viewed from this aspect, he writes, Scotus' doctrine of haecceity applied to the human person would seem to invest each with a unique value as singularly wanted and loved by God, quite apart from any trait that a person shares with others or any contribution he or she might make to society, unquote. The aforesaid is supported further by Father Ephraim Battoni, who rightly appraises this philosophical gem within its proper setting. When Father Battoni writes, to each individual, God has assigned a definite place in the harmonious complex of reality. Each individual is like a note in the grand symphony of creation and furnishes new evidence of God's magnificence and bounty, unquote. Haecceity takes on an even deeper meaning when looked at in full view of the human person and community, when seen as an integral feature to the teaching of St. Francis. And here I quote from Admonition 5. Consider, Francis says, what excellence the Lord has placed you. For God created you and informed you in the imagery of the beloved Son according to the body and to his likeness according to the Spirit, unquote. Some years ago, Brother Ed Coughlin was to comment on the above, writing, taken together, the admonition and the principles of Haecceitas provide a firm foundation for understanding the essential goodness and value of our shared humanity, as well as the inherent dignity and absolute value of each person, unquote. The dignity and values of each thus understood, it is then to extend our wisdom to meet the contemporary challenge of forming and sustaining authentic communities in our digital age. We find guidance for this in the thought of Friar Roger Bacon. Owing to the sheer breadth of his work, Friar Bacon was to advance understanding on everything from happiness theory to language study, mathematics, optics, and defending the scientific method. Truly, he was a visionary of scope and substance. For our present discussion, it is Bacon's epistemology that we find the most assistance. How then are we to know the merits and limits of technology and its influence? To ask the proper question is half of knowing, Bacon once wrote. And he was to remind us that herein we find a distinction in knowing. And I quote here from just a common source that in Bacon's epistemology, we find the pivotal concepts of his philosophical efforts. and how they revolved around utilitas, or utility, and sapientia, or wisdom. Bacon used the concept of utility in the context of his reflection on the relation, scope, and goal of the sciences. More specifically, he used the term in two senses. Number one, to describe the hierarchy between the sciences, and number two, to refer to the function of the sciences, namely the improvement of the physical and spiritual well-being of humankind in this world and the next. For our purposes, Bacon's epistemology provides the necessary distinction between our orientation to science, and I would mention by extension, technology, understood in its importance as instrumental, and the wisdom capable of understanding technology's role in advancing the dignity of the person. So, acknowledging the instrumental role of technology aids in our understanding the authentic, as it has the inestimable value of the person at the relational forefront of community. When online, when Zooming, teleconferencing as well, how is the presence of the person, the reality of our humanity, even less, I ask? Only the medium differs. Bacon's position in upholding technology for its utility should be ours as well. It is evident here that technology should be valued for facilitating community over and above the surface groupings or reductive cyber meetings. The latter is seen in the contemporary language, where we make contacts, we network, we can friend or unfriend in a click. And I just want to make note here, it's small wonder that the dictionary pairs the definition of unfriending with networking. Then there's, of course, the reality of trolling and the ubiquitous selfie and so on. Still, we have Forster's exhortation to connect, his notions of connections conveying the bigger, sharper picture, reminding us that the contemporary authentic community is more about ontology than technology. In the end, it is about presence. Harkening back to Marcel, the formula of authentic community as being understood always as being with. Presence is co-presence. Through a Franciscan prism, the authentic community we seek is buoyed by the constancy of our remembering the communal instant between Francis and the sufferer of Hansen's disease, the leper, which says nothing about networking and everything for the privilege of the encounter. Let the contemporary encounter embrace like, understanding that participation in the digital world should narrow our understanding of community, but rather expand it, viewing the all that is before us as an invitation to flourish. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
I'll start off with something. Earlier today, I was listening to Barbara speak, and Barbara, your presentation was on preaching and sort of, you recently had talked with the 20 prior priest about that. And I'm listening, the whole concept of this conference is about authentic communities. I think now, listening to what we talked about earlier, I do think about, you never have a classroom. And I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, and I've been working under a certain construct of a classroom for 20 years. And then all of a sudden, COVID hits, we're online, and all my different cues of what I thought made that authentic community an authentic community is no longer there. So for instance, I know that as a professor, if I get a test in, I always had in the back of my mind in the old days, well, they may be cheating, but I got ways of dealing with this. Today it's almost like a paranoid type thing, like if they're online, like, what can I do? What can I do? I'm completely helpless. Could you, like I said, that's my own thing I'm looking at. Could you provide some commentary on, am I being just too paranoid? How do you think I should proceed with this?
No, I don't think you're being paranoid at all. I think you're being duly concerned here. In her presentation, Smee used the term mutuality. And that's what we're really involved in. That's what teaching is, or let me say it's a beginning point for teaching. So when COVID struck, and this was mentioned last night as well, And we had what, less than a week, we had a matter of days to transition to online. I never posted so much in any of my classes, especially at the beginning. I wanted to make sure that the students felt as welcome as possible, and more so. So I kept up and I kept online as much as I could. There were no set hours. I went over and over and again to make the effort to make sure that they knew that they were welcome and more. So I think you're doing a great job. And I still do that today. If we constantly refer to them, and again, I come back to Sister's very insightful mention of John and the calling by names. It's more often than not in online, we find ourselves blanketly responding. I find it very helpful if we do what we do in class. If someone says to you in class, and they raise their hand, you respond by, okay, Jennifer, that was a great point, etc. Why not do that? And we do it. I do it every time I can online as well to make sure that individuality, their individuality is being acknowledged, because that's what teaching is about. That's where it begins from. So your question's a really good one.
Am I just getting used? Thank you for telling me I'm not being obsessively paranoid.
No, not in the least. We were all worried then. So,
but it does strike me that all the things like just the physical aspects of looking at people, smile, stuff like that we would use in the past to sort of validate the relationship, just isn't there anymore. And so being able to do something like that's a lot more different.
I looked up, that's another good question. I was looking up and I was trying to get the latest and the greatest on stats with technology. And I found that at the high end, phone attachment to phones can occupy 4.1 hours. Now, I don't know where the 0.1 came from, but let's just say 4 hours of your day. And that's a lot. And I mentioned to students, and I give an added lecture, at least one, if not two, on technology in every intro class now to talk about that and that interface. And the interface means not human to human, not co-presence, but your presence and with the phone. And if someone's looking at their phone 63 times a day, I wonder if we can cut that back just a little to smile at a friend or to make a friend. How many times have each of us walked into a class at the beginning of the class and it's never been quieter? I don't remember this 15 years ago or 25 years ago when I was teaching. You'd walk into class and there'd be conversation. Now it's quiet because they're occupying that 4x3 inch or 4x2 inch little box they're staring in. And I think that does have an effect, but we can compensate for that by doing what we're doing now. Showing them, as Bacon did, imparting the wisdom as Bacon imparted to us, that it's the instrumentality of technology. It's there to be used. It used to advance the dignity of the human person, not in any way stifle it.
Tim, I don't know if you can hear me. I just have, thank you for your thoughts. One question which I know continually rivals us at the university is, do we allow students in virtuality to non-video their faces? And you have no idea what they're doing on the other side if they're even listening to you. Any thoughts on that in terms of our virtual world and teaching?
Our connection with one another is through visage. It's our face. So I'd like that. I'd prefer that. Sometimes when I'm online, though, I have to share a computer and I'll be using something that doesn't have video capacity. And I understand that if that's where they're coming from. But I think the openness of community is at facing one another. And let me say as well, I had this wonderful, I just went to a wonderful presentation by Professor McDivitt this morning, and she was talking about the imposters and the imposter versus the authenticity. And I tried to tell students this all the time, that if we want to know, get involved. If we want to know, participate. Life isn't a spectator sport, it's the ultimate team sport, and being present means being visible, sister. So that would be my take on it. But that's a wonderful Franciscan question. Let's see your face, because we want to, in other words. And I think that's where love begins, right? I also tell students this, that they often think that, look, St. Francis, okay, St. Francis is something we see in the home improvement store, et cetera. It's the statue there. And St. Francis is rightly linked with the ecology environment. But I remind them too that his patronage also extends to dying alone, right? Francis would always be the face that you would see there. And that loving face that we could see, that's what we want in community. So.
And we certainly have to add that Claire is the patron of technology. So
No, that's it. And TV viewing.
TV viewing. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Anything else? Good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Tim. And Conrad, you are up. Make co-host. Here you go.
Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for the organizers and for the co-chairs. I don't know how it happens, but when I'm at any event at SBU, it's always, Todd Palmer and Jim Mahar present. So I guess you are sleeping on campus as well. Different hours, different times on weekends and on holidays. So, and I, of course, feel privileged to be here among distinguished speakers. And, circling back to Sister Mary presentation, I also think it's a duty to engage in a conversation on creating a common good or a society which can flourish, especially, and maybe I'm biased because I'm from Poland originally, so I'm speaking in the context of the ongoing Russian assault on Ukraine, where basically, if we just nail down the reasons for this war from the Russian perspective, basically it's about the narrative us versus them, where in fact them are completely dehumanized to justify the war, the attack, right? And that's, I think it's just an extreme example of this us versus them and lack of the common good. But I would like to share my presentation and go over a few slides. And I have a little bit different presentation. It's completely from a secular view. But I think, I always thought about the results, the initial results of my studies as a starting point for a discussion, especially among or within the Franciscan institutions on certain issues. So let me just start the presentation and share it. Just a second. Okay. Sharing the screen. Okay, it's here. Can you see it? Yes. So the topic of this presentation is related to two phenomena which are well discussed, nowadays in different societies, not only in the US, around the world. Basically, it's about income inequality and trust, more specifically, generalized trust. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons why societies have become fractured. And we can talk about income inequality and also low trust between citizens. And there are, of course, multiple studies which associate, the income inequality with adverse consequences for societies and individuals. And I will go quickly over some of those studies, as well as, the generalized trust. If it's low, it's also not good for societies and economies. So let's just look at this background, and I will explain my view on the relationship between income inequality and generalized trust, which is contrary to the mainstream view, but with some serious implications for policymakers. So we know that income inequality, it's in the air for at least a decade or more in the US, in Europe, everywhere around the world. And just few quotes, it has been called like the new apartheid. There was an article in the Financial Times a few years ago, and in other places it was called, after in the US the Supreme Court decided that there are no limits for individual donations to political campaigns. So instead of saying about the American democracy that it was one person, one vote, someone said it's basically $1, one vote. And even the former president, Barack Obama, he talked explicitly about income inequality and trust in the society in one of his yearly annual State of the Union addresses. It was in 2014. In a recent article in The Time, for example, the authors talk about income inequality as the elephant in the room, although it was in the context of COVID, but they cited, an interesting study by the Rand Corporation, where they argued basically that if the income inequality has been which had been like in the US after the Second World War, if it had been kept in the US, every American right now would get an additional $1,100 a month in terms of salaries, right? So this is how huge the change was in terms of the income inequalities in the US. And why we are talking about it, because in multiple studies across different domains, scholars reinforce those common perceptions that income inequality is not good. Especially they found that it relates to slower economic growth, political instability, low trust in the society, and, for example, worse average health in a society as well. And the recent study, for example, one of the outcomes they found is that, in fact, COVID mortality was higher in countries with higher income inequality. So that was a recent paper. So, and what about the second phenomenon I mentioned, generalized trust, and why it's important here? So generalized trust is understood as a general willingness to trust our others. So it's basically how much do we trust other people, strangers in general. And it has been found that it's relevant to a range of social science disciplines, to the economists, to management scholars, to political scientists or sociologists. And they also argue that generalized trust is essential for large-scale cooperation. For example, as a society, as a nation, and also in organizations, in corporations, in companies. So there are multiple studies showing this relationship between generalized trust, so how much do we trust others in general, to different outcomes, including development of democratic societies and prosperous economies. And for example, a recent study by Grafland in 2020, he looked he analyzed the panel data, so data over time from the OECD countries for the 25 years, and he found that generalized trust positively moderates the relationship between economic freedom and human development. So in other words, the policy implication from that study is that free market institutions would foster human development, but only when societies have this high trust, right? So when the generalized trust is high in that society. So we have those two phenomena, and this is the graph where each dot represents a country, and on the x-axis we have the income inequality measured by Gini coefficient, and on the y-axis we have trust. And as you can see, the simple regression shows well, the relationship between generalized trust and income inequality is such that the higher the income inequality, the lower the trust. And people look at this correlation, and in fact, many scholars, they argue, they try to demonstrate that this relationship is causal, so that the high income inequality leads to low generalized trust. And obviously, we don't want this kind of relationship. We want high trust and low income. Of course, there are some studies which found no relationships or like kind of mixed results, but the vast majority of studies show or demonstrate or argue that there is a negative causal relationship between income inequality and generalized trust. So, in other words, the most common interpretation is that high income inequality leads to low trust in a society, okay? And obviously, it's not a good income. We know from other studies, it's not a good outcome for any society, for any country. However, when I looked at those studies, and coming from a country which experienced the rule of communists, I somehow question this logic or this interpretation, because we used to have low income inequality, but the trust was very low, so people didn't trust strangers, okay? And starting with this observation, my personal observation, I tried to look into this relationship, and I thought about an alternative explanation. So in fact, my proposition was that, well, perhaps inequality and trust are just two sides of the same coin, and the same coin is basically culture. So there could be some cultural values or rules or norms which at the same time increase or facilitate income inequality and decrease trust. So it's like there is a third variable basically which influences both in income inequality and trust, but in opposite direction. That's why we see this kind of correlation, negative correlation. So I know that we have limited time, so I just wanted to go very, very quickly and show or explain the idea behind it. So instead of seeing this causal relationship between income inequality and generalized trust, I would argue that cultural values would influence both income inequality and generalized trust, however, in the opposite direction, right? So cultural values, those cultural values which facilitate or grow or make income inequality more prevalent or acceptable, at the same time don't facilitate the development of generalized trust in a given society. And I based my research on a cultural framework by a scholar whose name is Salomon Schwartz. So as you perhaps know, there are quite a few cultural frameworks. The most famous one, I think, is Hofstede. So everyone talks about it and everyone heard about it. But Schwartz, and this is my favorite one because he created his framework based on theoretical assumptions, and he dig into existing literature. He created his model, his values, and then tried to validate it. And it, of course, went contrary to, for example, Hofstede model, where it was basically a theoretical model created based on the results of the analysis of the data from IBM offices around the world. So Schwartz's approach was, let's call it, more scientific, and that's why I like his framework. So basically, he introduces 6 cultural values, or in other words, 3 dimensions which are bipolar. So I will just introduce one dimension to explain, how it works. And let me just keep those slides. And so one of the dimensions in Schwartz model is autonomy embeddedness dimension. So on one side of this dimension, we have the cultural value called autonomy, and on the other side, we have embeddedness. And by definition, a country, a group, a society cannot have both. You are either higher on autonomy or on embeddedness. Of course, you can be in the middle, but you cannot score high on both. So, and the argument would be here for trust, for example, that in autonomous cultures are more prone to develop trust between people because there are incentives. If you want, let's say, to build a new relationship, if there are no strong social controls, which are the typical features of embedded cultures. So if you don't have those social controls, you have to have trust into strangers to start developing new relationships. So autonomous cultures are conducive for trust development. On the other hand, in embeddedness cultures, there are social controls which prevent, in fact, or make generalized trust not necessary in a society. So, and there are lots of papers on this. There is, for example, the work of Yamagishi, the sociologist Yamagishi, who observed the Japanese society compared to the US society, and he made those kinds of arguments. But in fact, in Japan, what we observe in groups, in those tight social groups, it's not trust, it's basically assurance, because nobody deflects, nobody cheats, not because they trust each other, but because there is an assurance of the strong social control. So if you cheat, you will be excluded from the group, and not because people will stop trusting you, but because this is the rule, or those are the rules in a society. This is the expected social order. Okay, so, and there are two other dimensions in this Schwartz framework, but I just want to see to show you the results of the study and some conclusions and suggestions for policymaker. What does it mean, or what would it mean for policymakers? So, and this is statistics, so I know it's boring, but I just wanted to highlight one thing. So it's marked in red, and as you see in this is the results of the regression model. It's whether generalized trust is related to cultural values, and we can see that autonomy, so one of those dimensions, is positively related to generalized trust as expected, right? So we know that cultures high on autonomy are also high on generalized trust. And here, in fact, I made kind of a more robust analysis. I used panel data from European countries, and I checked whether it also holds, if this relationship also holds over time. And you see the last column, model 4, it shows the relationship between cultural values and generalized trust 4 years later. So we can see the relationship is significant. So the interpretation would be that the cultural values also have significant, at least statistically significant, influence over trust measured 4 years later. And it was done for European countries with the data available over time from the European Social Survey. And when we look at the income inequality again, we see a similar relationship, but in a negative term, right? Which is again as expected, because if we look at the autonomous cultures, for example, there is theory, and we can discuss the theory. Why in autonomous cultures income inequality tends to be lower, and we have this negative sign, which is in expected direction. And similarly, in cultures high on harmony, we would expect lower income inequality. So, just to summarize it, what does it really mean for, or what could it mean for policymakers? So we know, or I demonstrated. I mean, this is the first of this kind of studies, but I hope to do more to make those results stronger. Even though I already received comments from one reviewer from a sociologist journal in Europe that this idea is absurd. That was the exact quote, even though in fact I'm not inventing the theoretical arguments, for example, for this relationship between income inequality and culture. I'm using the Nobel Prize winner arguments, for example, and it was Mr. Stiglitz, who argue as well that informal rules and norms in the society basically influence the level of income inequality, which is basically how culture influences income inequality. But anyway, I think we can see pretty well, especially taking into account this analysis over time, that cultural values really influence trust and income inequality as well. I had this analysis also for income inequality. So there is a relationship in time, so we can even talk about causal relationship, right? So we have those discoveries and confirmation that certain cultural values at one hand, they facilitate development of generalized trust, but at the same time, decrease or don't facilitate the development of income inequality, which is what I would expected at the first place. So, what does it really mean for policy makers? So it means that any attempts by policymakers to increase trust by lowering income inequality using any kind of distributive policies would be in vain, right? So even though the policymakers may achieve lower income inequality, it will not translate into higher generalized trust because it's just forced reduction of income inequality. It's not related, or it's not going through cultural values. So culture will not change, most likely, or at least not in short term, and the trust will not be affected, even though it was hoped by the policymakers to increase trust by reducing income inequalities, again, by distributive policies. But distributive policies, it looks like they will not be fruitful. So what I would suggest, based on the results, is that instead of distributive policies, policymakers should acknowledge that income inequality and trust are both influenced by culture, although of course in opposite directions. So therefore, they could do at least two things. So first of all, creating some laws, rules, and formal institutions which will complement those lower levels of generalized trust. And on the other hand, they could promote or emphasize those cultural values that could facilitate the development of generalized trust. And at the same time, de-emphasize the cultural values that help to grow income inequalities. And of course, it's a work, or it's a task for years to come. It's not a thing you can change quickly. Although, in fact, from the data, we see that in Europe, for example, the cultural values change over time. So it's not like that you cannot change culture. Well, yes, you can. It will take years, not months, but it's doable. And I would also like to make some connections to the presentations we've heard today early morning. It was about focus or refocus on common good. I think this is one of the ways how policymakers can work both on increasing trust and decreasing income inequality by refocusing on common good. So, like, for example, making sure that everyone understands, every citizen understands that we are not living in a vacuum, and that pursuit of common good is necessary for all of us, right? It's beneficial to the entire society. And also we can talk about like the us versus them. We talk about diversity as well, but it's also how we approach this, right? Because by artificially creating or emphasizing the difference between us and them, we are basically decreasing trust, and we want to avoid it. And I would like to conclude with a quote or statement by Morgan Freeman. He had an interview once about 10 years ago with a journalist, and the question was about racism. And Morgan Freeman basically said, well, if you want to get rid of racism in the US, you have to stop talking about it. And he said something like this to the journalist: I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm asking you to stop calling me a black man. And I'm Morgan, and I know you as Mike. And I think that would be the right approach to get rid of those labels. And when we are talking about connections, communications, relationship, just start talking or calling each other by name, or not, and not by not by being a member of a certain group, let's say. And thank you very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, I'm be more than happy to answer.
I think I have one question that came up. Could you go back 2 slides, I think it was, with the, yeah, so implication for policymakers, creating laws, rules, formal institutions, which will complement lower levels of generalized trust. Could just like, and I'm trying to imagine this from a, as you know, the rest of them may not know, I teach finance. So I'm trying to think it from a financial perspective. Are we saying increasing transparency so that we just start off with the fact that various stakeholders are not going to trust each other, and we have to increase what they can see, or I'm not sure what that looks like.
Yeah, so I mean that's of course up to debate, but that would be, I think, a great example, one of the examples, right? So increasing transparency definitely helps. And again, I can tell you from my personal experience in a country which was under the communist rules, one of the reasons why there was the trust was so low, the trust for strangers, that there was no transparency, right? Or even worse, what was said publicly was never done, right? So this is one of the way. Definitely transparency is very important here for the generalized trust. Yes.
So, but I guess I'm worried that if we have, so in the creating laws, the laws are that you have to be transparent, right? I mean, I'm guessing, because anything that we try to create a law about, I'm thinking might actually come back and bite us in the fact that we are back to the us, them, you're doing it because whatever, not that you want to do it, that you have to do it. If we just increase transparency, maybe that less of a problem.
I think so. So again, transparency would be one of the ways to increase trust. And whether we are talking about trust among friends or people who know each other already, or it's about trust towards strangers. Yeah. So I think that would be one of the examples.
Conrad, I think back about 15 years ago when the internet was just becoming big for the popular community, and people are saying, well, geez, once people are able to communicate with each other easily, the trust level will rise, because all of a sudden you'll be getting all types of viewpoints and perspectives. And of course, I think we can argue this the exact opposite has happened, that the mechanism that we thought that would increase trust actually has decreased trust. So looking at this, transparency is definitely one thing. What other things would you see that might encourage trust when, like I said, here's an example, one that sort of backfired on us dramatically?
So I think, if we are talking about the whole society, so what could help in developing trust between citizens, especially trust towards strangers, is also focusing on common good. So again, just let me give you one example from Poland right now, what's happening in Poland right now. So there are millions of fugitives from Ukraine right now, war fugitives. And guess what happened in Poland? Because also of the actions of the government, I mean actions or words, but also because, how people reacted. They know, or we know, we people in Poland, we know that Russia doesn't have good intentions anyway. So people started hosting strangers from Ukraine in their own homes. And I have many friends in Poland who did just that, even inviting them to a small apartments. So one friend of us, she has 2 kids and 2 bedrooms, and she invited a family from Ukraine to her house, right? Family who was fleeing from there. And basically there are no camps for refugees in Poland, or no long-term camps, because everyone is taken care of by some Polish family, right? So And I think that shows lots of trust towards strangers, especially so because it's not only someone else from your neighborhood, but it's someone from different country. Even though we have some, commonalities in history, some common, history, but it's still, someone from a different country. How you can do it, how you can achieve this kind of trust, and of course we can say that it's an extraordinary situation, so many people would react perhaps the same when facing war or the danger of war, so that's why they open their hearts. But if you then create an atmosphere, I think that it's no longer us versus them, because in fact before this war started a month ago, there we could see or observe or have this kind of understanding that Ukrainians in Poland now are not treated but like perceived as economic immigrants, right? So because before the war even there were already 2 million Ukrainian immigrants in Poland, but now we have 2 million more. However, it looks like there is no us versus them anymore, right? And how it happened, I guess it's also a miracle, with some kind of explanations which are only possible through spiritual, religious lenses. This is how I would comment this.
Thank you, Conrad.